Now, before we get to the actual topic here, I want to point out that I am going to put in the chat, and it's also going to be in the description, about my Patreon for people who want to be patrons and donate to my podcast to help me as I am on disability, as I do with all live streams and my videos. You'll see this either in the chat if you're live, or if you actually go into my or if you go and see this later, you will see this actually in the bottom of the description. You will see it on there, and it gives you the address to go to, and feel free to donate whatever you can. All the monthly donations are really appreciated. Anything from like $1 and up is really greatly appreciated, as it really helps me live month to month. Thank you. With that, and we're going to go into this topic, being the Constitution, either original intention or as a living document. Now, I'm going to preface this discussion stating that I do support the idea of the original intention, because of just the way I've grown up with it and been taught it, from my actual background of having a history degree, bachelor's degree, and with the master's in public administration. This is the background that I really have with this. So I believe in the original intention, though there's people out there that believe this as a living document. Now, where we need to look at is where these two theories have come from, and where it actually goes to when we're talking about what it actually comes out to be, what it would mean. And I think the best way to view this is with viewing the Bill of Rights itself would probably be the best outcome, because it's something that's people have a good general outview of, and one can look at a few of them and see where these things would actually lead us, and it gives us a kind of a general outview of what's really going on. And we get the Bill of Rights directly from the National Archives, so we're not getting any type of leaning from any sort of way. This is exactly directly just put into an actual printed form. So it takes the actual original text of actual handwriting and pulls it into a printed form, so there's no type of adjustment to the original formula of the way it was written itself, and gives us all of the amendments that were put forth, which is a nice way to view it in a nonpartisan format. Because you go to some of the other sites, they will tend to use formats of text and ways of using text to essentially outline certain things to make them look better than they are, or essentially not focus on certain things and focus on certain points of that certain certain amendments, and omit certain other parts just basically for political reasons of that certain group, and we're not going to do that. Now, when we look at the different aspects with it, a living document basically states that the way the Constitution is viewed, that it can actually change with the times, and it does not need an actual amending to do so. It can be viewed by the judicial in any such method that modern times requires, whereas for a new viewing, whereas the original intention views it in a very direct manner as the original founders viewed it, as in their manner of the time, and it does not change no matter what occurrences happen. And this is very, very different, because what we see is a lot different now. There's also a couple different aspects of it as well. When we see it is the idea of a living document tends to put the idea of rights to a collective right, and they tend to do this a lot, whereas the idea of the original intention tends to put the rights on the individual, and it continues with that idea to this day. And this separates big time between the two. And it depends on where people fall between the two things. There's not really any in-between idea. You really can't be an in-between type of person. Either you view it as it can be adapted without any such constitutional amendments, or you can to a modern day, such as stating that because of terrorism they can use the NSA to spy on people without using Fourth Amendment capable warrants, and using that excuse. Or you can state that yes, they're or you can state in the original intention stating that that there was terrorism by name within 3 years after that point, and terrorism had existed not by necessarily by name but by action since the first decade AD, or actually since 1 AD I should say. And the theory that's that they didn't have terrorism when this was written would have been erroneous, and that they actually hadn't considered this when we look at other sections of the document. When we look at the actual rules of what the legislature had to deal with, it shows specifically that of what to do with terrorism, and that since terrorism was mostly committed on the seas because that was the only way to get to the United States, that they specifically mentioned that, specifically referring to as piracy. So we know that existed, and that's why that's for people that refer to the idea of original intention. And this is why we tend to view those as people who refer to as individualism. And there tends to be a very big breakdown. Now, where did the real big breakdown tend to happen during the progressive era? Now, why we tend to blame the progressive era is because of they tended to view things in a greatly different manner, because they wouldn't have had any of their bills passed had they not changed the theory from the original intention, which focused on the individual rights, to a collective right which allowed them to change what was necessary. And this is something that's very, very important to understand, because they had this idea that many of them, they were progressives, had this idea that we needed to censor certain people, that certain people needed their rights restricted. So the idea needed to be that a collective needed to be the way to dish out rights, and that we couldn't have individual rights because that would be destructive to this idea. And you'll find out with when you start to study ideas of, when you start looking up stuff on the original ideas of progressivism, and when you start to just learn about their start out in San Francisco, and you'll start to learn when you start learning about them in the middle 1800s. I should say middle and late 1800s. You'll start learning about them. That's what they were really about. And this was a very kind of puritanical group that was really against this idea of individual freedom. And they knew that if you could essentially break it down into a collective, they could essentially break it away from people having these rights. And you could have this new association of what rights were supposed to be. And this is why we associate this with essentially one of your darker periods of the actual idea of freedom, which is why we saw the internment of the Japanese Americans during this period as well, during the Progressive Era. And there was no legitimate reason for it. When we look at historically, you'll see that as well, that they did not get any trial, and it was based on, again, a collective right that they tried to assert, that they are some large collective. And this goes to the whole idea. And this is why when you start to view things as a collective next to, or a collective and a living document next to the idea of individual rights, you will see that that just in the idea of looking at different amendments, such as the First Amendment right here, looking at freedom of religion, Congress shall make no law respecting the establishment of religion nor prohibiting the free exercise thereof. Now what that's changed to throughout history is this idea of separation of church and state, and basically stating that we cannot have religious symbols in public. Now, it does not state anything thereof. And this has been the idea of a living. This is where you get judicial figures viewing it as a living document. They view that is somehow expressly meant to be in there. And the term separation of church and state does not appear anywhere in the Constitution. This is just a statement that has actually been made. It just states that the actual United States will not make will never make a state religion, nor will prohibit you from following whatever religion or lack thereof that you want. It never states that any symbols cannot appear in public of religion. It just basically states that they cannot establish an actual state religion. And this is basically, when you look at the history, we see that and that this is where you get the differentiation between the living document and the ideas of the original intention. And this is very important. When we view the living document, they start reading into things that aren't really there. And they tend to view things as this idea of, they'll start to say ideas of collective rights right there, meaning that the free exercise thereof is no longer for individuals. So basically you're talking is you cannot have freedom of religion within a public area. So they'll actually do that, and they view this as an actual collective right. Thus, you no longer have the access to do to express your freedom of religion within a public arena. Now, this is essentially where we see a breakdown, and where we see a massive breakdown between the two theories. And you will find this in many areas. They will state that you will find many public schools that'll basically say kids are not allowed to set up prayer groups, and we've seen this even be fought in courts. And where public schools will actually have that as an actual rule, stating, citing the First Amendment and stating separation of church and state. Because why? Because they're stating collective, the idea of a collective right. And they'll say you're infringing on the rights of other students. Well, it doesn't. It's actually the rights of the individual need to be protected. And this is the whole point of where we get to the original intention. Now, when we start to look through it, you'll actually see on the idea of abridging freedom of speech, you'll see the idea of a lot of times that will be looked upon from we're seeing sometimes that will be looked on from a collective right, and they'll tend to view as long as a majority of people have the freedom of speech, there's no problem. Well, it needs to be that everyone has it. And then you'll see one of the big things is that I've seen recently is freedom of the press. Now, this is a thing where they basically one of the people is Dianne Feinstein is stating that she wants basically to establish what the press is. This is the delineation between these two theories of thought. Is what originally was the press was anybody who was producing any type of news content. This is what originally meant. Now, when you have them deciding what press is you essentially have then the removal of this right, and that means it's a collective right. And they want to do that, and that's where you get to those points. Another one on the Second Amendment. They tend to where we find this one is quite unique is they tend to misuse the point on the third word is regulated. Now, regulated, when we look at the actual meaning, it meant to be that it's these people, the militia, which was only supposed to be used in an absolute emergency by the actual state, if there was an insurrection or unnecessary for war. Now, what the purpose of war was, when we start to look at the now this is going on the original intention. The purpose of war was actually meant for was basically when the actual nation itself was attacked. Now, this would not be from where we provoked an attack. This would be only in the case where we were attacked unprovoked. Thus, World War II would not apply, because essentially when we look at the actual facts, we had a president that was providing aid to Mao Zedong and was telling them to attack Japan, and was working with them to attack Japan and cut off their food supply. That's going to essentially cause tensions between Japan and the United States, and Japan will then retaliate. That was essentially a retaliatory attack. Thus, the attack would have not been considered as an act of war. The actual actions that we're working with China to do the different cutoffs of food, the blockade of food and supplies to Japan, and the attacks, supporting attacks from China to by supplying them with weapons to attack Japan, would have been considered as an act of war. Thus, essentially, that would be considered as the point of the act of war. Thus, that is not considered to be where the militia would have essentially aided. The militia will only aid in the case of where it becomes defensive. And that's the whole point. And this is where we need to understand what it was meant to be. Now, it's not meant to be. Now I've used points like the term draft before. With it's not necessarily like a draft. It's where they will supply their. They will essentially essentially go and volunteer themselves to the military. Now these were essentially these were essentially, it's not an actual militia by an actual name. There's not like an Illinois militia and a Wisconsin militia and an Indiana militia. No. These are essentially armed individuals within each state that are actually meant to essentially that are keeping their role, their constitutional role to keep peace. Now, and are actually armed. Now, what happens when they, if you look at the Declaration of Independence, now you'll look at that, and you need to look at that as well. Now, that will make mention of what happens when the state becomes tyrannical. Now, that means the militia does not have necessarily a full linkage to the state. Now, the state only has a an actual liability to train them when a war is necessary. There's no real linkage between the two other than that. And that's what needs to be understood. Because if the state is being tyrannical, they really have no other linkage, because there is no actual other compensation other than those points when they volunteer themselves, and then the state will compensate them. And this is a major point that needs to be understood. And it says, being necessary for the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. Now, when we're talking about this, is what needs to be understood is this shall not be infringed. Now, what people tend to look at is they go, oh, but they didn't have, is what tends to be the main point is when we look at these things is there's two major points. Number one is you get a lot of these, most of the, not all, but most of the people believe it as a living document, believe the militia as police. This is some of them with it. The other people believe it as individuals, but some of them believe it as police, and those who believe it as police need to understand with it that what happens when those people would essentially be called up, it would be irrational to think of them as police. That means there would be no police left to serve the communities. Now, if we look at the other portion, is of those who don't. Now we're gonna so we get to the other portion. When we look at the idea of those who do not believe as police, now these are a lot more constitutionally sound. But when we start to look at that, is they tend to not understand the term of regulated, and this is a problem. Regulated was actually meant to refer to about training and about equaling them up to the level of everyone else, and it turned to be about the actual idea of a certain type of quality to even them up to everyone else. It did not refer to anything about the guns, because when it refers to the actual idea of the guns, that was actually completely separated, as we see further on down the line. And this is where we find the actual problem. This is why specifically we'll find that, as we say on here, that they believe it as a collective right. And if you keep that as a collective right, you can essentially state that not everybody has the right, and they can essentially create certain meanings on these things to mean different things. This is why we view it as a living document. They can state, well, while the state cannot infringe on all people's right to own guns, they can essentially it can just state that this means that they cannot infringe on people's right to own guns, but since it's a collective right, they can take certain people's right away and limit those people who they view as incapable to do it, because this is a collective right, mind you. And then they can use this term regulated to mean to regulate the actual firearms. This is where you get a big difference in the idea of individual, the aspect of the individual liberty and rights next to collective. Now, why specifically do they talk about larger groups and next to smaller groups on this? Well, specifically because when we talk about the Constitution, it's actually meant to limit the government. It's not meant to limit the people. It's never been meant to limit the people. When we go over to the Fourth Amendment, we see another problem with a lot of differences. I shouldn't say problem. I should say a lot of differences between the two groups of living documents next to original intention. And here's where we find that they tend to view, when it says the right of people to be secure in their persons, houses, papers, and effects against unreasonable searches and seizures shall not be violated. No warrant shall issue upon probable cause, supported by oath or affirmation, particularly describing the place or persons to be searched and persons or things to be seized. Now, what they find in it is technically, usually people under this usually find that they view it as, number one, a collective right. So what happens to be is they view people under this as they can mean Verizon, can be a person. So you can, so it can make it, so they can make a bulk warrant. And they can say that what it called, they can say there's a probable cause amongst somebody under the Verizon. There's a potential probable cause under one user of Verizon in one of these warrants. And this is the whole point. And they can say the reason why they cannot do it is for national security, why they cannot be releasing the other side. Now, when it comes down to it, and this is where we get a whole big difference, and this is where we're talking about collective rights. And when we're talking about people and persons, and I mean, we're talking that basically is that they're using it in the sense that there's a living document stating that this would be normal, but they'll use the excuse of terrorism, so that this cannot be applied in such a way in all cases. And this tends to be one of the other points where they end up using. Now, what we also find is that they tend to basically view as the one of the things that they'll state is they'll view the 9th and 10th Amendment. They tend to view those as ignored. They'll tend to, what ends up happening is they tend to ignore or gloss over. This is where a lot of the power that goes to the individual, and this is what happens with a lot of the people who believe as a living document. They tend to view these as ones that are maybe meant for the time being, but not necessarily legitimate now. And this is one major controversy between the 2 points, where some of the points of the where it tends to view the points of the individual over the state, and the living document tends to be a lot more collective in its points of rights. When we come to the idea of when we look at the living document, and the idea of the original intention was always looking at the individual and just looking at those points of view. And we can see that basically is when we tend to view things on the original intention, we can see that it's basically a thing of that we're not going to that we're not basically going to have the same output of these, the way that things are viewed. This is why when you look at different people, will take two people on the court, such as basically we'll look at Neil Gorsuch and we are going to look at we'll look at if you look at if you look at Neil Gorsuch and you compare that with such as Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg, you're going to find a complete difference between the two. And it's something that is very, very curious of what ends up happening. And this is something that needs to be understood. And I think that when we start viewing that, is people are going to understand that that's the real difference between the ideas of how a constitution can be read. And it's not necessarily that we're talking about good and evil or any ideas like that, which is completely absurd. But necessarily what we're talking about between collectivism and individualism. And we can even go into the political spectrum, which is going from more libertarian to more statist, which is where the actual realm should be viewed as. Do you want bigger government, or do you want a more powerful individual? And this is the whole point, and this is where the actual things go. A living document is not essentially going to be viewing as modernizing the Constitution to the modern day, but in actuality, it essentially creates the idea of a more powerful government. These are the ideas of going with precedent over what's right for the individual, and the things that would actually be precedent over what's right for the individual would be such as doing against what would have caused the 13th Amendment. Now, the 13th Amendment is essentially what is quite interesting, because if it were under precedent, then that would have never passed. And it says, with that one specifically, neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except in punishment for crime whereof the party shall be duly convicted, shall exist within the United States or any place subject to their jurisdiction, and Congress shall have power to enforce this article by appropriate legislation. Now, if that were, if we were to look at that by, if we were to look at that amendment by actually viewing it in such a way that it was constitutionally, in viewing it as in such a way as the living document people would say, they'd say, well, slavery is been used before, we need precedent, and they would let it go on. Now, major arguments are precedent tends to be an argument of it doesn't matter what the activity is, but because it still goes on, they want it to continue, regardless of how heinous the activity is. That's number one, and regardless of any new evidence that proves against it. And number two is because when we're looking at individual liberty, now individual liberty does not play into it. They tend to look at because the idea of precedent here would essentially play over the idea of individual liberty, because you're viewing it as a collective. You're viewing as precedent of what would actually impact the collective over what would essentially be best interest for individual liberty. And essentially, if it's a heinous activity that would be going on, regardless of what we're talking about here, and doesn't matter what activity we're talking about, that's where that idea would come from. Essentially, they would say, well, we have all of these slave owners that just really depend on these slaves, so because it's precedent, we should just let it continue. And that would be the position of your people that are from the aspect of your living document, because they would say the collective is more important than the individual, and the individual liberty is would not take precedent over the collective. Thus, the original intention would not survive, and thus that idea of that if we would have people like a Ruth Bader Ginsburg judging on that point, regardless of what the issue is, they would essentially view as the 13th Amendment would not pass. This is why the idea of DOMA was actually verified as being completely legitimate the first time, and was allowed to be verified by people like Ruth Bader Ginsburg. Yet when it became unpopular, she voted to overturn it. And this is what we saw, and this is really, when it comes down to it, you see an exact definition of what becomes part of the idea of voting for the collective. But when she was essentially going, when she viewed that it was unpopular from multiple aspects, and precedent would no longer have been viewed as being viewed as a opinion that would have suited any type of point, she voted to remove DOMA and sided with that. That's why essentially you saw two sides that were completely opposite, but yet voted from the same person. Now, when we view that from an originalist would have stated that setting any such standard on something like that would have been unconstitutional, and because government would have had no business being in that decision to begin with, and would have had no business deciding any such a law. But it would have been, but there were many reasons why it was passed, such as the First Lady at the time, Hillary Clinton, was pushing for it to be passed, and that's another major reason why it passed to begin with. And when we look at the whole thing of the of why we differentiate between these two, you'll see that you get the whole different outcome. I mean, looking at the 13th Amendment, essentially you get the idea of precedent. Now, when we look at such people as Kavanaugh, in many aspects, Kavanaugh is not an original intention person. He, very much like Kennedy, is really a living document type of person, because he tends to go with precedent on many issues. While he might state on certain issues that he might go with original intention, but when it comes to a lot of issues that are involving human nature, he tends to opt for precedent, which is not an idea of original intention. Precedent never is not an idea of original intention. It's a collectivist idea, and it doesn't matter what the idea and the precedent is. You have to opt always for the individual rights, regardless of the issue. I mean, if it was precedent to for men to kill their wives after 10 years of marriage, if that was precedent, and that was allowed, you don't just say, hey, we're going to continue this as precedent and not prosecute these people for homicide. No, you say we're going to essentially go on the idea of individual liberty, say these people should be basically prosecuted and stopped from doing this. And this is where the difference in how these things go. And you have to rule on the side of the individual. And that's the idea of original intention. When we're talking about ideas of liberty, you don't have collective rights. And that's what the idea of original intention. That's why I fall into the camp of original intention. The living document falls in the idea of collective rights, and you just you don't have collective rights, because collective rights means you belong to a collectivism. You're talking about collectivism, and that goes to a lot of ideas of stating that you don't believe that individuals have any ability to control their lives, and that government dictates these things as privileges. Because if you do not consider the idea of individual rights and actually natural law, you're essentially stating that these are not rights but actually privileges. And that's essentially what you're doing by going with the idea of a living document. And there's a complete difference. Now this is why we don't talk about when people try to assert rights from commodities. This is why we don't talk about these either with it, because we cannot assert that the labor of someone else is a right. You cannot assert that basically, hey, that guy has a boat and I don't have a boat, so since I don't have a boat, that boat should be mine. And that's essentially what the idea of when people state free healthcare is. Free healthcare requires the labor of someone else, and that's the whole point. This is why we do not allow that to be assumed as a right, because it's not what we call a negative right, and that's why that was never in the Constitution. But though you have people arguing on the basis, and this goes back to the idea of the living document, that they'll state, going back to not only on this document, but going back to the idea of the Declaration of Independence, stating that the pursuit of happiness means they have to be happy, and that what it called judging on the point of life means that the government has to assure that nothing can happen, that they can die, meaning they have to protect them cradle to grave. And that includes free healthcare, free food, free housing, free water, free transportation, free jobs, and for all these other freebies that basically are at the behest of taking from someone else through force, which is taxation. Now, this is why we get the idea of why a living document is the idea of collectivism. And since we take our two documents of the nation seriously, this is why we look at the two specific documents. We have the Declaration of Independence, and then we also have the United States Constitution. These documents are need to be looked at very, very seriously, and they're actually tied together. We also need to look at other writings as well to understand them, look at the history of the era. We also need to understand this, and we also need to look at other factors such as the such as the actual writing themselves around the era, with it by these people that were actually writing these. They were actually involved in writing the documents, such as Jefferson and Madison. And if we start looking at these things, we'll understand a lot more about like their foreign policy, why they stated specifically that they did not want foreign entanglements, which meant no allies. Now you might go, well, what does no allies mean? Well, that means you're not going to have allies, but you're going to have diplomatic relations with all different nations. And this means that basically you're going to have a lot of a big different way of creating a foreign policy. It's going to be based on non-intervention, and that's going to be a lot different than what we do currently. You're not going to be policing the world, and it's going to be where you're not going to be this policeman of the world, and it's going to change the way you view things. And this is another thing why we see this, why we see a lot of people push toward the idea of a living document. Now, I've seen a couple people from the military view this living document, but not many. Most of the people from the military, I find, tend to view the idea of the Constitution as the original intention, and there's a very good reason why. They don't want to be put into harm's way. They're very, very big stickler for that because they don't like being shot at. And these are people that tend to view it in a very, very simple way, and they tend to view things either from foreign policy, from either a realist or an identity the identity perspective, the realist perspective or the identity perspective, and it tends to be a lot different. So when we're talking about the idea of foreign policy and foreign entanglements, they tend to want to be as far away from it as we get. And that's a lot different from when we consider such things as what people from the living document tend to be from the liberal foreign policy perspective, which is completely different from what the idea of self-preservation would be for a military member. You don't want to be a person that's basically going to essentially say, yes, I want to basically be in harm's way. That's not self-preservation. But when we look at the idea of living document, it focuses on collectivism, and it doesn't put you ahead of the other people. And I think that's actually quite curious that we find certain people take this approach with that on the military. Now, I don't find many people from this aspect with it. I've always found people from this aspect outside of school. When I went to school, I was finding people that were actually active military members. They were actually they followed either the realist perspective or the identity perspective, which is completely different. I think when you get some of these people that maybe if they haven't deployed, or if they've been deployed, maybe they've been deployed to safer regions, but the ones that have actually had to deploy out to Iraq, Afghanistan, out to Syria, out to Pakistan, some of these regions like that are highly dangerous, and still have to do their actual classwork. I think those people are actually a lot more on the ball when it comes to the idea of understanding the Constitution from the perspective that's a little more from the perspective of being a little more would be in the idea of what would be basically in the idea of what their what would be self-interest, which is basically not dying. And what would be for not dying is an actual policy that would not involve going toward the idea of a collectivist society. And that's where we get the idea of focusing on the original intention over a living document. I found so many people when I went to school that focused on the original intention. They completely rejected the living document theory, and that's where we found it at. And it was it's just something that that I found that when I went to when I was in high school, certain people believed in the living document. When I was in college, it was basically they felt the living document was completely brain dead. But when I get out with it, they tend to see the living. That's where people think the living document's like a legitimate thing, and I think this is a case of where people just are ill-informed. And I see some of these people that believe in the, and I see some of these people say, "Oh, the people with original intention don't know what they're talking about," and this is just, I think, people that have actually don't even understand what they're talking about. Now, the original intention are people that actually understand the actual Constitution per written and understand that these that the founders were actually able to see beyond their actual years that they wrote the actual Constitution itself. So when I even seen people say, "Oh, but that they couldn't see into the future," well, yes, we understand they could not see into the future, but they had a perspective knowing that technology was going to improve on everything, but they understood the idea of individual rights was not going to change, and it shouldn't. And they understood that this was something that needed to be preserved, and that they understood by looking at the past of what governments were going to try to use as excuses to take over individual rights. And this is why they would perceive a document based on that thing. Now, what they did not perceive is that people were going to become so weak and start to fall for a lot of these tricks. That's one thing I would say that they did not perceive, that people were going to become so disinterested in their actual individual rights and focus on ideas of taking selfies and eating laundry detergent over actually the idea of trying to support their individual rights over everything else. And I think that's very important to understand. And this is something that's crucial when it comes down to things. And this is something that we need to understand, is that collectivism is really an evil that is really basically is taking away everything you have. And it was something, basically, this is something that goes back to the progressive era, that this idea did not really exist before that point. And even back then, they knew that none of these progressive era laws could not even pass to being constitutional without the stacking of the courts of people who believe this certain way. And that's why such as the New Deal, the 1938 Firearms Act did not pass to being constitutional without the actual assistance of the stacking of the courts, which is what Franklin Delano Roosevelt did. Now, without the stacking of the courts, neither of those two would have been ruled constitutional. They would have been rejected, thrown right out, and we would have essentially gotten out of the Depression much sooner, because essentially the New Deal was so great that it actually failed, so he had to do it again. And this is what ended up happening. Most people don't realize that the New Deal was actually a failure, and that's why he tried it again, which is exactly what the government does. Government says, "Hey, this is a failure, so let me try it again," which we call, in reality, we call that insanity. And this is the whole point that needs to be understood. And when we look at the whole point, is that we need to understand that you're going to have the government do these insane things. And when we look at the Constitution from these two aspects, is you can have the original intention, which is basically what the Constitution itself says, or we can actually have the idea of the living document, which is basically going to say that that these rights are collective, and that's going to be completely different, as we've gone over with the idea of the amendments themselves and showing how basically what we have. And if you basically feel that the government is not respecting your rights when it comes to the Fourth Amendment, when it comes to the idea of the Second Amendment or the First Amendment or any of it, if you feel that that's a serious problem, then you need to understand that that comes from the idea of them viewing it as the that comes from the idea of them viewing it as a living document. That doesn't come from any other point. Now, when we view these things as the original intention, you're not going to have this. This is basically because they're going to be forced to take things at directly what they state. And this makes things very, very difficult to abuse, because when they're following things at a direct formula, it makes it much more difficult to abuse the actual point. When they're forced to follow a rule, it becomes a lot more difficult to interpret in a wrong manner. Such as if we're looking at the Second Amendment or other amendments, you're going to find that the way that it gets actually viewed is they can't start abusing it, because they can't essentially ignore what it directly says, and they're going to have to view it in such a way that it actually impacts. Now, people who believe the idea of the living document tend to say, "Oh, but it won't be impactful for the modern day," when they view such a thing as the Fourth Amendment. Well, the Fourth Amendment, when we look at the term of effects, this is something that it meant, what it called, to cover everything else that was not considered as persons, houses, or papers. So that means they understood that there's going to be new technology that was going to hold everything else. This means cell phones and everything else like that, cell phones and computers. And that means that basically they can't, this is what they were putting that stuff in there for. Now, when you got people who are on the idea of living documents, they're going to say, they're going to view these things as, well, we need exceptions here, and they're going to view these things as a living document and create the idea of, well, they didn't have terrorism like we have now, and that's what they're going to view it as. And they're going to make that exception out there. Now, there's many people, regardless if they're right-wing or left-wing, for the judges. It really doesn't matter. It's basically, are they going to rule for the state, or are they going to rule for the individual? And this is a major case of what we're talking about here. And this is the big difference of when we view a living document versus original intention. And it becomes a very big thing. Now, when we talk about individuals out there, this is going to be, are they original intention people, or are they going to be living documents? I see people who are a lot more intelligent on the actual reading of the document as being original intention. I see people who tend to not really understand the history behind the document itself, be more the living document type of people out there. This is just what I've seen out there from the people that I've met. The people that don't really understand the history behind the era and what these things mean, they tend to not focus themselves as being as well put together for their arguments. And they tend to focus more on the idea of the emotional argument over everything else. And this tends to cover over everything else, and they tend to see things in there that aren't in there, and this tends to cover up their arguments on what they're trying to make. And much of the living document is basically that is the idea is that because it's the idea of essentially amending it without going through the constitutional process. So theoretically, you're seeing things that aren't there to accommodate for modern life, even though the actual solution to modern life is using liberty, because liberty always works, and it will solve completely every issue you have. And we've seen this basically when we look at some of the issues. Basically is when we're talking problems with terrorism, basically stop attacking them so much, and they're not going to attack us as much, bring our soldiers home and establish more bases so we have more defense. Well, that's going to eliminate your issues with terrorism, which means basically they don't need to spy on us. Well, what's the issue with spying as well? Has it caught anybody? Well, no. Which means they don't need to violate the Fourth Amendment, which means the reading of the Fourth Amendment does not need to be wide, and they can essentially just respect it as is. And they could eliminate these facilities and delete all the data in it, because there is no purpose that they haven't caught anybody with the things. This is why we get the difference between the living document and the original intention. And that's why we see a huge problem between the two, and why we see just a huge, massive outlook between what one believes and what the other believes. When you have one person states this is a huge they'll say one type of point and go with the other point from the other aspect, and you're gonna see a whole different idea. I mean, you're gonna have you might have people from the ideas of a living document state that socialism is perfectly constitutional, but you're going to have people from the original intention state that because of the 13th Amendment, which essentially is which is stating you can't have indentured servitude, states that socialism is not, because you're essentially forcing labor, and which is essentially what you would need for nationalized health care. You essentially are forcing labor on it and forcing certain wages, because it would have to force wages about 30% lower than they actually pay, 30 to 40%. And because of this, which essentially is forced labor. And because of this, what it does is it actually creates a problem that is that doesn't include the actual taxation on top of that of what would cause with some of these ideas of the Green New Deal. That's just the idea of just the universal health care alone on these people, of what the healthcare workers would be succumb to. So what it would cause is that's essentially a violation of the 13th Amendment. Now, you could have people on the living document that say this is perfectly legal, but the original intention it states plainly there that there is no indentured servitude without an actual punishment. And when we look at the idea of what these people are doing, they're doing nothing but trying to earn a living, and there should be no punishment for that. And this is about it with it, because when we're talking about that, and that's why we see a huge difference. Now, if you like this, like, subscribe, click the notification bell, share it all you want on social media. Share it with your friends. Make sure they subscribe. Share it with publicly to get them to subscribe. And see if you can't get anybody else to see my Patreon. And if you haven't donated with it, if you're willing to donate to my Patreon, it's either in the chat or down below here. And that's about it, everyone. Bye for the night with it. I'll be putting up one more video on the 8th Amendment. It'll be on Facebook here, or sorry, YouTube here. I don't know why I said Facebook. Bye, everyone.